Law. We shall here examine what is given the name law in the social formations that fall under the capitalist mode of production. It should be made clear in advance that we shall be making for the moment a purely descriptive analysis. We shall take up the same question in more theoretical form once we have acquired the means to do so. Chapter 11. Law is a system of codified rules. Consider the civil code, the penal code, public law, commercial law, and so on, which are applied, that is to say, both respected and circumvented in day-to-day practice. To simplify our discussion, we shall focus on private law, contained in the civil code. Private law is, moreover, the legal base from which the other sectors of law set out to systematize and harmonize their own notions and rules. We can say very schematically the following. Private law states, in systematic form, rules governing commodity exchange, that is, purchases and sales based, in the last instance, on property rights. Those rights, in turn, are derived, explicite, from the following general legal principles: legal personality, civil personality, which defines individuals as legal persons endowed with defined legal capacities, the legal freedom to use and abuse the goods one owns, and equality before the law. For all individuals endowed with a legal personality in our present law, this means all human beings, with the exception of a certain number of rejects, excluded from equality before the law. That said, what shall we say about law? We should note three characteristics, on which, moreover, Marx and Engels, following Kant and to some extent Hegel, put the accent. 1. The systematicity of law. Law necessarily takes the form of a system which, by its nature, aspires to internal consistency and comprehensiveness. We beg the reader's pardon for introducing these two apparently technical concepts here. They are easy to understand, insofar as law is a system of rules that are applied, that is both respected and circumvented. There has to be consistency among all the rules of the system, such that one cannot invoke one rule against another. If that were possible, the effect of the first rule would be cancelled by the effect of the second. That is why law tends to eliminate all possibility of internal contradiction, and why jurists engage in the extraordinary activity of systematization that has from time immemorial elicited the admiration of ordinary mortals. That is what makes jurists jurists, with a maniacal concern for rules and the cases to which they apply. At the same time, however, law must be comprehensive, sacer. In other words, it must represent a system of rules which, tendentially, cover every case that could possibly present itself in reality, so that one is not brought up short by something that is not juridically covered, and could allow non-juridical practices to make their way into the law itself, undermining the integrity of the system. Hence another admirable aspect of the activity of jurists, who have from time immemorial striven to absorb the disparities of customary law and the gaps and deviations of case law, application of the existing rules to concrete cases that often go beyond them in the law itself. This activity of systematization is accordingly to be understood not only as elimination of the contradictions that can arise among the rules of existing law, but also, and above all, as elimination of the eventual contradictions that may arise between the rules already defined in the internal system of law and the paralegal limit practices of case law, the essential role of which is to identify cases that the law has not yet really integrated and systematized. In this regard, case law must obviously be brought into relation with laws outside, the existence of which the history of law recognizes in the form of what is known as customary, as opposed to written legislation. Every system of legal rules gives rise to a written codification. Let us, however, leave this point aside. It interests us only insofar as it indicates, from the standpoint of the security of the law itself, the existence of a more or less threatening outside of the law. 2. Formalism of law. Law is necessarily formal in that it bears not on the content of what is exchanged between legal persons in of purchase and contracts of purchase and sale, but on the form of these contracts regulating exchange, a form defined by the formal acts of legal persons who are formally free and equal before the law. It is to the extent that law is formal that it can be systematized as tendentially non-contradictory and comprehensive. Law's formalism and its correlative systematicity constitute its formal universality. The law applies to and may be invoked by every person legally defined and recognized as a legal person. The formalism of law is usually regarded as, and criticized for being, formalistic. Thus it is judged and criticized from a moral standpoint. A moral standpoint is a moral standpoint. It produces approval or condemnation. But law is indifferent to whether it is approved or condemned. Law exists and functions, and can only exist and function formally. The obvious effect of law's formalism is to bracket in law itself the different contents to which the form of law is applied. But it by no means makes these contents disappear by enchantment. Quite the contrary, the formalism of law makes sense only to the extent that it is applied to defined contents that are necessarily absent from law itself. These contents are the relations of production and their effects. Hence, we can begin to see that law only exists as a function of the existing relations of production. Law has the form of law, that is formal systematicity, only on condition that the relations of production as a function of which it exists are completely absent from law itself. This singular situation of law, which exists only as a function of a content from which it abstracts completely the relations of production, explains the classical Marxist formula. Law expresses the relations of production while making no mention at all, in the system of its rules, of those relations of production. On the contrary, it makes them disappear. The distinction between the relations of production on the one hand and law on the other is fundamental in Marxist theory. Confusing them gives rise not only to very serious theoretical mistakes, but also to the very serious political errors that follow from those theoretical mistakes. It is in fact imperative that we make this distinction not only in order to analyze what happens in the capitalist mode of production, but also in order to anticipate what will happen in the socialist mode of production. It is perfectly obvious, to take just this one example, that it is wrong to define the socialist mode of production in terms of collective or socialist ownership of the means of production. It is wrong to define the socialist revolution as the transition from one kind of ownership to another, from ownership of the means of production by individuals or monopolistic groups reduced to a handful, to ownership of the same means of production by the collectivity. That is, the state on the one hand and cooperatives on the other. For to talk about collective ownership of the means of production is to talk about not socialist relations of production, but let us say socialist law, and to mistake so-called socialist law for socialist relations of production, if we stick to this purely legal definition of the socialist mode of production, we risk very serious disillusions. Experience is there to prove it. We know that Marx always defined the relations of production constitutive of the socialist mode of production, not in terms of collective, socialist ownership of the means of production, but in terms of their collective or common appropriation by freely associated men and women. Thus he refused to define in terms of law that which cannot be defined in terms of law, even if it is called socialist law. This refusal goes very far in Marx, for in his view all law, since it is in the last instance the law of commodity relations, is marked by this indelibly bourgeois defect. Thus all law is by essence, in the last instance, inegalitarian and bourgeois. See on this question the admirable, but too brief, comments to be found in the Critique of the Gotha Program. What then are we to understand by collective common appropriation of the means of production by freely associated men and women? Clearly, while the problem is posed by this programmatic formula, which eschews all reference to law and all legal domination, the solution is not provided. The debates that this problem has occasioned and continues to occasion in the history of the Marxist workers' movement are well known and far from over. Some do not go beyond state and cooperative ownership of the means of production. Socialism then becomes a matter of economic planning. They claim that good socialist law and good planning realize, spontaneously and concretely, the appropriation of the means of production of which Marx spoke. Others wish to move immediately to direct appropriation by the agents of production, by establishing self-management, which for them is this appropriation. Slogans such as workers' power or economic democracy issue or have issued from this tendency. Things are not simple. They are not simple because we must not confuse the socialist relations of production enabling common appropriation of the means of production and later communist relations of production with the relations to be established in the phase of the transition to socialism. For if socialism must not be confused with communism, the phase of the transition to socialism, of the construction of socialism, must a fortiori not be mistaken for socialism. In the transitional phase in question, the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, one does not yet have to do, as Lenin repeated 1,000 times, with socialist relations of production, but with transitional relations in which so-called socialist law remains, by its form, inegalitarian and therefore bourgeois law, and in which state ownership and cooperative ownership are merely transitional forms, that the dictatorship of the proletariat must utilize as such in order to prepare in them, patiently, tenaciously, over a long period, the constitution of the future socialist relations of production. Lenin repeated this incessantly against all those who, ignoring the need to proceed step by step and to boot, proposing petty bourgeois solutions already quite classic in utopian socialism, wanted to establish workers' power, self-management, and economic democracy, or the democracy of production. If, however, we can agree to leave the problems of the transitional phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat to that phase, the first of them consists in knowing whether or not one has gone beyond the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and not confuse them with the problems of already constructed socialism. We can pose the question of the nature of collective, socialist appropriation of the means of production in its own right. We can ask to begin with what Marx meant by this programmatic term. Marx obviously meant something like the withering away of law, a correlative of the withering away of the state. The withering away of law can only mean the withering away of commodity exchange. Exchanges of goods in the form of commodities, naturally including, first and foremost, the commodity that labor power becomes in capitalist commodity relations, and their replacement by non-commodity exchange. We are thus inevitably led to the question as to how such non-commodity exchange is to be realized. The classic response runs through socialist planning. But what is socialist planning? It is plain that this is a burning question today, but it is one that bears the terrible mark of the very particular form that Stalin's politics impressed on Soviet planning from the 1930s on. We shall call it state étatique planning, rather than bureaucratic planning, since the bureaucracy effect is a secondary effect of a more general politics. All those trying in the USSR, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and other countries to make planning more flexible by introducing liberal measures are even today thrashing about within the limits established by this very particular form. The effect of such measures is to acknowledge and extend commodity relations at the very heart of these countries' economies. Likewise, posed within the limits established by this very particular form are the theoretical problems over which theorists in these countries are agonizing and arguing, and also proposing methods for resolving key questions. For example, the question of how prices should be determined. The labor theory of value, placed at the heart of these theoretical questions, as proper Marxist doctrine requires, is, if I may say so, put to a hard test in these debates. At the limit, an appeal is made to the double myth of automation and electronics, which are together supposed to make it possible, thanks to a hyper-centralization facilitated by gigantic computers, to resolve all these problems by magic mathematical planning with a little help which just happens to be indispensable, from the profitability criterion in the enterprises. I doubt that this technocratic solution, tempered with a dose of economic liberalism, which is uncontrollable in the long run, and the requisite sort of right-thinking humanist ideology, the necessary counterpoint, will provide us with the kind of socialist planning capable of materializing relations of appropriation of the means of production by freely associated men and women. We would do well to take a big step back from the form of planning imposed by Stalin's politics, which still commands these problems, in order to put things into historical, political, and theoretical perspective and re-examine them from a more correct point of view. That, at any rate, is my personal opinion. I offer it as such. But this step back and its effects presuppose political and theoretical conditions which, if the present course of events is any indication, are not likely to prevail any time soon, and will not come about without serious transformations that it will be painful to carry out. For very serious questions lurk behind these problems, even in the socialist countries. Questions of class and the class struggle, a circumstance that should not surprise Marxists. However that may be, it is clear that by way of the various experiments in progress, the Yugoslav experiment, from which we may already draw the certain conclusion that it is only a stage in a transition regression towards capitalism. Soviet planning marked by Stalin's conception, Chinese planning, the form and spirit of which are considerably different. In these various experiments, I say, it is well and truly a question of a search for unprecedented forms in which these much discussed relations of socialist production may one day exist as relations of real appropriation. It is also clear that the search for such forms is not just a theoretical question, even if theory has a very important part to play in it, the theory of Marx and Lenin, of course, but an eminently political question that can be settled only after the conclusion of political struggles. At bottom, economic, political, and ideological class struggles, of which we are now experiencing just the beginnings. Those are some of the reasons for which the Marxist distinction between the relations of production and legal relations is of the first importance. 3. The repressive nature of law. Law is necessarily repressive. Kant sees and states this very clearly in his Metaphysics of Morals, a work that has very little of the metaphysical about it, its title notwithstanding. In this regard, the Hegelian conception of law, with its delirious idealism, trails far behind Kant's. Law is repressive in that it could not exist in the absence of a corresponding system of sanctions. In other words, there can be no civil code without a penal code, which is the realization of the former at the level of the law itself. This is easy to grasp. A legal contract can exist only on condition that it is applied. In other words, on condition that the law is respected or circumvented. Hence, there must be a law of the application or non-application of law, that is, of the observance or non-observance of the rules of the legal contract. In a contract, two legal persons promise to make certain defined exchanges. At the same time, they promise to submit to sanctions if they fail to observe the terms of the contract. By way of the essential legal complement to law comprised by the system of legal rules for the sanction of non-observance of the terms of a contract, by way of the legal complement of the civil code comprised by the penal code, law recognizes internally that it could not exist, that is, be practiced by legal persons, without rules of repressive constraint. This is what Kant very clearly sees in his Metaphysics of Law. Law entails constraint. Naturally, however, he sees it from the standpoint of morality, hence as a difference between law, a formal, non-contradictory, comprehensive repressive system, and morality, a formal, non-contradictory, comprehensive system that includes an obligation duty which is without sanction and thus without repression. No one will be surprised to learn that our viewpoint on law is not Kant's, the viewpoint of its difference from morality, but an altogether different viewpoint, that of its difference from the relations of production. Things are now simple. Constraint implies sanction. Sanction implies repression, and therefore necessarily an apparatus of repression. This apparatus exists in the repressive state apparatus in the narrow sense. It is called courts, fines, prisons, and the various detachments, corps, of the police. It is by virtue of this that law is inseparably bound up with the state, fait corps avec l'État. At the same time, however, it is clear that the practice of law is not exclusively based on repression in Act 2. Most of the time, repression is, as the expression goes, preventive. It intervenes in legal state forms in a very small number of cases, over against the infinite number of contracts that are respected without the intervention in propria persona of the repressive apparatus or the initiation of a repressive process. In the vast majority of cases, things go without a hitch. The terms of the contract are observed. We must, however, pay close attention here. For law, legal ideology, and the supplement of moral ideology, common sense, that almanac verno of public asininities, will burst out laughing with its coarse laugh. It is fear of the gendarme, which makes the parties to a contract respect the promises they make in the articles of a contract. For as everyone knows, fear of the gendarme is the beginning of wisdom, to which decent people will respond, to all appearances with good reason, that if the gendarme is plainly on the horizon of legal obligations, he is by no means present on the horizon of the consciousness/conscience of the contracting parties. Better, he is absent in person. The decent people are right. Indeed, they are always right. But one must understand the reasons for which they are right. In the present case, we need only listen to what they say. If we observe the terms of the contract we sign, it is not, God forbid, out of fear of the gendarme, but out of simple decency. There do in fact exist honest people who sign contracts, people who do not at all need the fear of the gendarme to be honest. They are honest for reasons of simple professional conscience or simple moral conscience, and they sometimes derive a certain pride from this, when they do not derive more or less discreetly commercial advantages from it. For everyone in the national or international market knows that such and such a company is perfectly law-abiding and punctual, or even that such and such a people is Germans, Japanese, and so on, whereas other companies or peoples do not know how, properly, to behave in business matters, that is, how to honor their promises. Honor. We had better take the decent people at their word, for in spite of all the sarcastic remarks of a latent Poujardism and the petty bourgeois bitterness that does not imagine that it, the petty bourgeoisie, could ever have gone to ruin if it had not been swindled, the decent people are fundamentally in the right for good reason. Let us call that right reason by its name. Since a moment ago, we gave the repressive apparatus, part of the state apparatus, required by bourgeois law, its name. Let us give its name to this right reason as well. It is legal ideology and also moral ideology, which serves legal ideology as a supplement. The vast majority of legal persons observe the terms of the contracts they sign, and they do indeed do so without the intervention of, and even without preventive threats from, the specialized repressive state apparatus. They do so because they are steeped in the decency of legal ideology, which inscribes itself in their behavior of respect for law, and in the proper sense, enables law to function, enables, that is, legal practice to go all by itself, without the help of repression or threats. But we must pay close attention here too. Legal ideology is obviously required by the practice of law, and therefore by law. Law that is not practiced is not law at all, but it is not the same thing as law. Law says, writes in its codes, for example, every individual, except for the rejects comprising the exceptions we mentioned earlier, is legally free, to sign contracts or not, to use and abuse his or her property, and so on. This is a legal definition of freedom, that is, a definition of freedom by law, by the system of its rules, a perfectly precise definition of freedom that holds only within the limits of law and has nothing to do with moral or philosophical freedom, or even, as we shall see, with the freedom of legal ideology. Law says, for example, all individuals, except for the rejects and so on, are legally equal before every contractual act and its consequences, especially its penal consequences. This is a legal definition of equality, That is a definition of equality by law, by the system of its rules, a perfectly precise definition of equality that holds only within the limits of law and has nothing to do with moral, political, or metaphysical equality, or even, as we shall see, with the equality of legal ideology. Law says, for example, that we must respect the obligations we have signed. This is a legal definition of obligation, that is, a definition of obligation by law, by the system of its penal rules, a perfectly precise definition of obligation that holds only within the limits of law and has nothing to do with moral obligation or metaphysical obligation, or even, as we shall see, with the obligation of legal ideology. If we wish to talk about legal ideology with a modicum of respect for the facts and with some rigor in our terminology, we must say that while it does indeed take up the notions of freedom, equality, and obligation, it inscribes them outside the law, and thus outside the system of the rules of law and their limits, in an ideological discourse that is structured by completely different notions. To sum up the essence of these basic notions of legal ideology, we must pay attention to the following little difference. Law says, individuals are legal persons, legally free, equal and bound to honor their obligations as legal persons. In other words, law does not leave the domain of law. It brings everything back to law, honestly. It should not be reproached for this. It honestly plies its trade as law. Legal ideology, for its part, utters a discourse that is apparently similar, but in fact altogether different. It says, men are free and equal by nature. Thus, in legal ideology, it is nature, not law, which founds the freedom and equality of men, not of legal persons. That is a little different. There remains, obviously, obligation. Legal ideology does not say that men are bound to honor their obligations by nature. It needs a little supplement on this point very precisely, a little moral supplement. This means that legal ideology can stand upright only if it leans on the moral ideology of conscience and duty for support. The reader will have understood what we wanted to show. Law is a formal, systematized, non-contradictory, tendentially comprehensive system that cannot exist all by itself. On the one hand, it rests on part of the state repressive apparatus for support. On the other hand, it rests on legal ideology and a little supplement of moral ideology for support. On the horizon of every legal practice there is doubtless a gendarme who keeps an eye on things and intervenes, part of the state apparatus, when he must. Most of the time, however, he does not intervene and is even completely absent from the horizon of legal practice. What then is present, not on the horizon of this space, but in this space itself? Legal ideology, plus the little supplement of moral ideology. It is quite as if legal and moral ideology played the role of the absent gendarme and were his representative in the space of the legal practice of contracts. Someone who is absent is someone who is absent. The representative of the one who is absent is not the one who is absent, but his representative. Our diplomats know well, and thank God, for they would otherwise be crushed under the weight of France that, unlike de Gaulle, they are not France, but only its representatives. This allows them to have a little life of their own, a family, holidays and prospects, career prospects included. Legal moral ideology thus stands in for the gendarme. But insofar as it stands in for the gendarme, it is not the gendarme. This is not nitpicking or an idle distinction. This distinction is manifest, in fact, very precisely in the circumstance that the gendarme is a repressive force of physical intervention. He is accredited, after taking an oath empowering him to arrest a delinquent and bring her, handcuffed if necessary, before the proper legal authority, a qui de droit, who will require that she give an account of herself, with detention, jail, a trial, and condemnations at the end of the process. The gendarme is the violence of the state cloaked by an inoffensive or not so inoffensive uniform. Operettas are composed about him precisely so as to forget that he exists only by violence. We shall say that, in the guise of the gendarme, legal practice functions on the violence, the regulated violence of the state apparatus. However, as a general rule, In the vast majority of cases, there is no need for state violence to intervene. For legal practice to function, legal moral ideology is sufficient, and things go all by themselves, since legal persons are steeped in the glaringly obvious, self-evident truths that men are free and equal by nature and must respect their promises by virtue of simple legal moral conscience, baptized professional conscience to mask its ideological grounds. We shall therefore say that the practice of law functions in the vast majority of cases on legal moral ideology. Of course, the consequence of the way law thus functions on state violence and at the same time on non-violent ideology are incalculable, as far as both the relations of production and the forms of existence of the relations of production in the division and organization of labor are concerned. We shall obviously have to come back to this. But for the moment, we shall leave this crucial question in suspense in order to focus our attention on the following remark. Our analysis of the nature and functioning of law has brought us face to face with two realities, although we have made no special effort to seek them out, in whose absence the existence and functioning of law are literally unintelligible. These realities are the state on the one hand and ideology on the other. It is time to discuss them. The state. The Marxist tradition is categorical. From the Manifesto and the 18th Brumaire on, and in all the later classic texts, above all, Marx on the Paris Commune and Lenin in State and Revolution, the state is explicitly conceived as a repressive apparatus. The state is a repressive machine that enables the dominant classes in the 19th century, the bourgeois class and the class of big landowners, to ensure their domination over the working class in order to subject it to the process of extorting surplus value, that is, to capitalist exploitation. The state is thus, above all, what the Marxist classics have called the state apparatus. This term covers not only the specialized apparatus, in the narrow sense, whose existence and necessity follows, as we have seen, from the requirements of legal practice, that is, the police, courts and prisons, but also the army, which, apart from its national defense role, the proletariat has paid for this experience with its blood, intervenes directly as the auxiliary repressive force of last resort when the police and its specialized corps, the riot police and others, are overwhelmed by events. Presiding over this ensemble are the chief of state, the government, and the administration. Presented in this form, the Marxist-Leninist theory of the state touches on the essential point, and there can be no question at all of not recognizing that this is indeed the essential point. The state apparatus, which defines the state as a repressive force of execution and intervention at the service of the dominant classes in the class struggle waged by the bourgeoisie and its allies against the proletariat, is well and truly the state, and this well and truly defines its basic function. From a descriptive theory of the state to theory in the full sense. Nevertheless, here too this presentation of the nature of the state remains descriptive, as we have already noted about the metaphor of the edifice, base and superstructure. Since we shall often have occasion to use this adjective, descriptive, a word of explanation is in order to eliminate all ambiguity. When, in discussing the metaphor of the edifice or the Marxist theory of the state, we say that these are descriptive conceptions or representations of their object, we have no negative ulterior motives. On the contrary, there is every reason to believe that great scientific discoveries cannot avoid going through a first phase of what we shall call descriptive theory. This would be the first phase of every theory, at least in the domain that concerns us, that of the science of social formations. Accordingly, one could, and in our view, one must regard this phase as a transitional phase necessary for the development of the theory. We inscribe the fact that it is transitional in our expression, descriptive theory, bringing out by way of the conjunction of the two terms employed, the equivalent of a kind of contradiction. For the term theory is partially at odds with the adjective descriptive attached to it. This means, to be very precise, 1, that the descriptive theory really is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the irreversible commencement of the theory, but 2. That the descriptive form in which the theory is presented requires, precisely as an effect of this contradiction, a development of the theory that goes beyond the form of description. Let us clarify this idea by returning to the subject to hand, the state. To say that the Marxist theory of the state at our disposal remains largely descriptive means, first and foremost, that this descriptive theory is, beyond the shadow of a doubt, the real commencement of a Marxist theory of the state, and that this commencement provides us with the essential point, that is, the decisive principle of every later development of the theory. But that is not enough. We shall say that a theory is descriptive when we can perfectly well bring the vast majority of observable facts in the domain on which it bears into correspondence with its definition of its object. Thus, the definition of the state as a class state that exists in the repressive state apparatus sheds a very revealing light on all the facts observable in the various orders of repression in whatever domain, from the massacres of June 1848 and the Paris Commune, of Bloody Sunday and May 1905 in Petrograd, of the resistance, of Sharon, and so on, through the simple and relatively harmless interventions of a censorship that banned Gatti's play on Franco, or the translation of Diderot's La Religieuse into the cinematographer's moving pictures, to all the direct or indirect forms of the slaughter of the popular masses, imperialist wars, their exploitation, and the subtle everyday domination in which is revealed, in the forms of political democracy, for example, what Lenin called after Marx, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. That is the first aspect of the definition of a descriptive theory. In its second aspect, it is obviously at a stage in the constitution of a theory which itself demands that we go beyond that stage. For it is clear that, while the definition in question really does provide us with the means of identifying and recognizing the facts of oppression by linking them to the state conceived as repressive state apparatus, this linkage gives rise to a very special kind of obviousness, about which we shall soon have occasion to say a word. Yes, that's really how it is. That's really true. And although accumulating facts under the definition of the state multiplies examples, it fails to advance the definition of the state, the scientific theory of it, by a jot. If this definition were to remain at the first stage, in which it functions as a descriptive theory, it would risk finding itself in unstable equilibrium, as if it were poised on a narrow mountain ridge, on the point, that is, of falling to one side or the other. This instability and the attendant risk of a fall have been very well analyzed in a recent book. Here we shall note only the book's reminder that, precisely because of the instability of the descriptive theory of the state, certain Marxists, and by no means the least of them, have fallen to the wrong side of the path on the ridge by presenting the state as a mere instrument of domination and repression in the service of objectives, that is, of the dominant class's conscious will. This is a bourgeois instrumentalist idealist conception of the state reinforced by a bourgeois idealist humanist conception of social classes as subjects. Such a conception has nothing to do with Marxism, because it perverts what is ultimately the most valuable thing the descriptive theory gives us. Hence the need to fall to the right side of the mountain path, or to drop the metaphor, the need to develop the descriptive theory into a theory in the full sense. Here too, we have to be careful. To develop this descriptive theory into a theory in the full sense, that is, in order to grasp the mechanisms of the state in its functioning, rather than merely identifying and ranging the facts of repression under the concept of state apparatus, we think it is imperative to add something to the classic definition of the state as state apparatus. 2. The essentials of the Marxist theory of the state. What must be, if not added, then at least made very precise, is, to begin with, the fact that the state, and its existence in its apparatus, is intelligible only as a function of state power. The whole political class struggle revolves around the state, around the possession, that is, the seizure or conservation of state power by a certain class or power block. In other words, an alliance between classes or class fractions. This first stipulation accordingly requires us to distinguish between, on the one hand, state power, conservation of state power, or seizure of state power, the objective of the political class struggle, and on the other hand, the state apparatus. We know that the state apparatus can remain in place even after political events which affect the possession of state power without affecting or modifying the state apparatus. This is proved by the 19th century bourgeois revolutions, 1830, 1848, or coup d'etat in France, December 2nd, 185, May 13th, 1958. The collapse of regimes, the fall of the empire in 1870 or of the Third Republic in 1940, the political rise of the petty bourgeoisie, 1890-5 in France, and so on. Even after a social revolution, like that of 1917, a large part of the state apparatus remained in place after an alliance of the proletariat and poor peasantry seized state power. Lenin repeated that often enough. It was an anguishing preoccupation of his to the day he died. The book we have cited offers an illuminating, detailed discussion of this point. It may be added that this distinction between state power and the state apparatus has been an explicit part of the Marxist theory of the state from Marx's 18th Brumaire on. To summarize the Marxist theory of the state on this point, let us recall that the classics of Marxism have always maintained that the state is the repressive state apparatus. State power and state apparatus must be distinguished. The objective of the class struggle has to do with the possession of state power and, consequently, use of the state apparatus holding state power as a function of their class objectives by the classes or alliances of classes or class fractions, and the proletariat must seize state power in order to destroy the existing bourgeois state apparatus. In a first phase, the phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat, it must replace it with an utterly different proletarian state apparatus before going on in later phases to set a radical process in motion, the destruction of the state, the end of state power and all state apparatuses. From this standpoint, consequently, what we just proposed to add to the Marxist theory of the state is already there, black on white. It seems to me, however, that this theory, even completed in this way, remains partly descriptive, although it now contains complex differential elements whose play and functioning cannot be grasped without the help of a decisive theoretical enrichment. 3. The ideological state apparatuses. What has to be added to the Marxist theory of the state is therefore something else. Here we shall be advancing cautiously on a terrain on which Marx, Lenin, Stalin, and Mao have long since preceded us, but without systematizing, in theoretical form, the decisive progress that their experiences and procedures implied. Why? Because these experiences and procedures were restricted in the main to the terrain of political practice. By that, we mean to suggest that the classics of Marxism in fact treated the state in their political practice as a reality that is more complex than the definition of it given in the Marxist theory of the state, even when that definition is completed as we have just completed it. Thus they acknowledged this complexity in their practice without expressing it in a corresponding theory. We would like to try to sketch that corresponding theory. We know very well the sort of objection we will be opening ourselves up to, since we cannot put forward a single proposition that is not already contained in the records of the political practice of the proletarian class struggle. Thus it can be objected at every turn that we are not adding anything new at all. And in a sense, that is perfectly true. We nevertheless believe that we are adding something new, doubtless very little, since we are merely giving theoretical form to something that has already been recognized in the practice of the proletarian class struggle. Yet we know, thanks to the same Marxist classics, that this very little, casting the practical experience of the class struggle in theoretical form, is or can be very important for the class struggle itself. Without revolutionary theory of the state, no revolutionary movement. We shall lay our cards on the table. We are going to advance and defend the following thesis. To produce a theory of the state, it is imperative to take into account not only the distinction between state power and those who hold it, and state apparatus, but also another reality that must clearly be ranged alongside the repressive state apparatus, but is not conflated with it. We shall take the theoretical risk of calling it the ideological state apparatuses. The precise point on which our theoretical intervention bears is thus these ideological state apparatuses in their distinction from the state apparatus in the sense of repressive state apparatus. Be it recalled that the state apparatus comprises, in Marxist theory, the government, administration, army, police, courts and prisons, which together constitute what we shall henceforth call the repressive state apparatus. Repressive should be understood at the limit, for there exist many, very varied, and even very subtly occulted forms of non-physical repression, in the strong, precise sense of using physical violence, direct or indirect, legal or illegal. What, then, are the ideological state apparatuses, ISAs? The following provisional list will give us a rough idea of them. The scholastic apparatus, the familial apparatus, the religious apparatus, the political apparatus, the associative apparatus, the information and news apparatus, the publishing and distribution apparatus, the cultural apparatus. This list is provisional because, first, it is not exhaustive. See Chapter 12. And second, because it may be that apparatuses 7 and 8 are just one apparatus. The reader will perhaps bear with this last hesitation, for I have not yet made up my mind on this point, which calls for further research. This list, in which, for example, the family figures, and these terms will not fail to cause surprise. Let us be patient and proceed in orderly fashion in order to arrive at a provisional but clear definition. First remark. One can observe empirically that there exist institutions or organizations, as they are called, corresponding to each ISA. For the scholastic ISA, the various schools and their various levels, from the primary to the tertiary, the various institutes and so on. For the religious ISA, the various churches and their specialized organizations, for example, youth organizations. For the political ISA, the parliament, the political parties, and so on. For the information and news ISA, the press, the various newspapers or newspaper groups, the RTF, and a large number of publications and organizations. For the familial ISA, all the institutions that have to do with the family, including the famous associations of parents of school children and so on. For the cultural ISA, all kinds of entertainment, sport included, as well as a series of institutions that may dovetail with what we have called the publishing ISA. Second remark, for each ISA, the various institutions and organizations comprising it form a system. That, at any rate, is the thesis we are putting forward. We shall see what constitutes the unity of the system in each case. If this is right, we cannot discuss any one component part of an ISA without relating it to the system of which it is a part. For example, we cannot discuss a political party, a component part of the political ISA, without relating it to the complex system of the political ISA. The same holds for a trade union, which is a component part of the system constituted by the associative ISA, and so on. Third remark, it can be seen that the institutions existing in each ISA, the system they form, and consequently each ISA, although defined as ideological, is not reducible to the existence of ideas without a concrete material support. I mean by this not only that the ideology of each ISA is realized in material institutions and material practices. That is clear. I mean something else. That these material practices are anchored in non-ideological realities. Take the family. It is an ISA, but the ideology that it realizes is anchored in a reality that is not purely ideological. For the family is the site of the biological reproduction of representatives of the human race, of their rearing and training and so on. Let us say that it reproduces the existence of labor power. But the family is clearly also something else. Even in our capitalist societies, in which it is now disappearing, it preserves, at least in certain now disintegrating sectors, the role of a production unit, for example in the countryside, family farms. In the mode of production based on serfdom, the family was the dominant production unit. In our mode of production, this is a survival. On the other hand, the family still is a unit of consumption in our societies. It is not the only kind of unit of consumption there is, but of those in existence. It is a kind that still plays an extremely important part, and it is not about to disappear. It subsists in the socialist regimes with which we are familiar, albeit in transformed or waning forms. For example, the cultural ISA, the ideology that it realizes is anchored in practices either aesthetic, the theater, film, literature, or physical, sport, that are not reducible to the ideology for which they serve as a support. The same holds for the political and associative ISAs. The ideology they realize is anchored in a reality irreducible to that ideology here, the class struggle. The same holds for the ISA we are calling the scholastic apparatus. The ideology it realizes is anchored in practices that make it possible to acquire and use objective know-how irreducible to that ideology. An ISA, such as the religious apparatus, in contrast, does in fact seem to exist up in the air as a function of the pure and simple ideology that it realizes. But this is by no means certain. Later, we shall attempt to say why. These three remarks will allow us to state a provisional definition. It foregrounds the reality, namely ideology, which unifies in systems the various institutions or organizations and the various practices present in each ISA. We shall say that an ideological state apparatus is a system of defined institutions, organizations, and the corresponding practices. Realized in the institutions, organizations, and practices of this system is all or part, generally speaking, a typical combination of certain elements of the state ideology. The ideology realized in an ISA ensures its systemic unity on the basis of an anchoring in material functions specific to each ISA. These functions are not reducible to that ideology, but serve it as a support. When the time comes, we will explain what we mean by the state ideology, the existence of which accounts for the fact that the ISAs are ideological apparatuses and state apparatuses, and also for the unity that makes each ISA a specific system distinct from the other ISAs. We can now come back to the concept that we are proposing, ideological state apparatus, in order to examine each of its three terms and justify the fact that we have associated them in our concept. Readers will doubtless be surprised at seeing these realities, diverse institutions or activities, designated as apparatuses, a concept that obviously brings the expression state apparatus to mind, and they will be intrigued at seeing us attach the adjective ideological to the term apparatuses, only to discover finally, at the tail end of this expression, the state itself, ideological state apparatuses. It is as if we wanted to bring out that the ideological is, as it were, stuck in the middle of the expression appareil d'état, with the small difference that the term state apparatus tout court is in the singular, whereas our ideological state apparatuses are in the plural. All this obviously calls for explanation. In presenting our explanation, we shall set out from this singular situation in which ideology is stuck between appareil and état, precipitating the passage from the singular state apparatus to the plural ideological state apparatuses. We shall go straight to essentials. In our capitalist societies, what distinguishes the ideological state apparatuses from the repressive state apparatus is the following difference. Whereas the repressive state apparatus is by definition a repressive apparatus that makes direct or indirect use of physical violence, the ideological state apparatuses cannot be called repressive in the same sense as the state apparatus, because they do not by definition use physical violence. Neither the church, nor the school, nor political parties, nor the press, nor radio and television, nor publishing, nor entertainment, nor sport have recourse to physical violence in order to function with their clientele. At any rate, the use of physical violence is not manifest or dominant in them. It is of our own free will that we go to church or school, although school is mandatory. Join a political party and obey it. Buy a newspaper, switch on the TV, go to a cinema or a stadium, buy and consume records, paintings or posters, and literary, historical, political, religious or scientific works. This is to say that ideological state apparatuses are distinguished from the state apparatus in that they function not on violence, but on ideology. We have already uttered this sentence in discussing the way law functions on legal moral ideology. We know what that means. These apparatuses apparently function all by themselves, without recourse to violence. In fact, they function thanks to means other than violence, namely on ideology, or rather, ideologization. With that, we have very clearly marked the distinction that sets the state apparatus apart from the ideological state apparatuses. It remains to explain why we consider it imperative to use the apparently enigmatic term state apparatuses to designate these institutions and activities: churches, schools, the political system, radio and TV, the theater, the press, publications, and so on. Why state apparatus? And why this plural, state apparatuses? Our affirmation becomes still more enigmatic when we take the trouble to note, and it is in our interest to note this ourselves, for if we do not, others will not fail to take issue with us, that if some of these institutions are now state institutions in our country, the school, certain theaters, radio and television, not all of them are. The church in our country is officially separate from the state, as are some schools, and so on. The press, political parties, trade unions, and other associations, the vast majority of cultural institutions and activities, entertainment and sport, publications, the arts, are free. That is part of the private sector, not the state sector. Better, in certain capitalist countries, a large proportion of the schools, for example 2/3 of higher education in the USA, and even radio and television in the USA and Great Britain, belong or can belong to the private sector. By what right, then, do we say that these institutions or activities fall into the category of ideological state apparatuses? 4. Public and private institutions. We have to clear away the following objection. By what right do we list private institutions, such as those that belong to the religious apparatus, political apparatus, cultural apparatus, and so on, among ideological state apparatuses? This objection is in fact based on a distinction drawn in bourgeois law, the distinction between public and private. This distinction concerns only the status, that is, the definition, of the legal persons who hold formal title to this or that institution. Such persons can be individual private legal persons, Mr. Gallimard, or collective private legal persons, the Dominican Order, collective state legal persons, our state educational system, and so on. The legal grounds for personhood are legal grounds. Since law is universal and formal, we already know that it abstracts, by its nature, from the content of which it is the form. But since it is precisely that content that matters to us here, the objection based on the private/public distinction is trivial. Our point is that the legal objection that might be raised against us is not germane. Our subject is not law, but something quite different at the limit of the class struggle and class relations, which the law is perfectly incapable of encompassing, even if it sanctions certain of its formal aspects, since that is its function. To put this in a way Marxists will understand, even certain non-Marxists know this, since they sometimes find themselves saying it. Marxists are well aware that the state itself, despite all the articles of constitutional law defining it, it is exempt from the civil code, and that is no accident. is always the state of the dominant class. It is not that the state is the dominant class's property in the legal sense, inasmuch as class does not yet figure, as far as I know, among the legal personalities recognized by law, although they are numerous. It is quite simply because the state is its state, the bourgeoisie's state, in the sense that the bourgeoisie holds state power and exercises it by way of the repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatuses. Let us take another example which, this time, will not admit the least objection. The papers that are legally owned by Mr. Provost, like the peripheral radio and television channels that are owned by Mr. Sylvain Florat and others, and come under the private sector and are therefore part of the civil code, have a right to exercise their imaginations a bit. This credits the notion that they are free and independent. But everyone is aware that they know perfectly well how to toe the bourgeois state's political line when they have to, that is to say, day in, day out, and with great fanfare on the big days, and to disseminate, in variants suited to their respective audiences, the grand themes of the bourgeois state's never-ending ideological litany, the grand themes of the state ideology. Thus, the private/public distinction cannot call our thesis about the ideological state apparatuses into question. All the private institutions we have mentioned, whether owned by this or that individual or the state, function willy-nilly as component parts of determinate ideological state apparatuses, under the state ideology, in the service of the state's politics, the politics of the dominant class. They do so in the form specific to them, that of apparatuses that function primarily on ideology, not on repression, like the repressive state apparatus. That ideology is, as I have said, the state ideology itself. I mention, for good measure, one last argument, which completely invalidates the legalistic objection that might be raised against our concept of ideological state apparatuses. The legalistic argument applies at best to institutions, but as we have said, and repeat here, an institution is not an ideological state apparatus. What constitutes an ideological state apparatus is a complex system that encompasses and combines several institutions and organizations, as well as their practices, whether they are all public or all private, or whether some are public and others private, is a secondary detail, because what interests us here is the system they form. This system, its existence, and its nature owe nothing to law. They are indebted to the altogether different reality that we have called the state ideology. The ideological state apparatuses and the ideological byproducts of their practices. Precisely because we are foregrounding ideology, we have to draw a distinction of great importance. May we make a personal confession here? For years we were baffled by a very brief hint of Stalin's that practically came down to saying ideology and the institutions corresponding to it. What in the world did that mean? Was it not an astonishing slip and, what is more, an idealist slip to grant that institutions could, in a list, follow their ideology, that ideology could, in some sense, produce institutions, when a right-thinking materialist should, putting the horse before the cart, have talked first about the institutions, and then, only afterwards because determined in the sense of derived, about the ideology corresponding to them? For do we not in fact daily see the institutions we know, the church, the schools, the political parties and so on, producing, precisely, the ideology that corresponds to them because they need it? Does a Sunday gardener not produce on his little fenced-off plot of land the vegetables and flowers that his wife needs? I am afraid that, on this point at least, I will have to show a little personal gratitude to Stalin for his hint, which I cite from memory. For in order to grasp the new concept that we are proposing, ideological state apparatuses, it is necessary to grant the paradoxical fact that institutions do not produce the ideologies corresponding to them. Rather, certain elements of an ideology, the state ideology, are realized in, or exist in, the corresponding institutions and their practices. Let there be no mistake. We do not deny that the institutions in question produce, internally and in their practices, certain forms of ideology that would be inexplicable without references to those practices. Thus, we shall say that religious practice produces inside the church certain forms of ideology, ecclesiastical ideology, for example. But there are other ideologies in the church. To stick with that example, these days it is teeming with them. Consider Isolotto, the letter by the 360 French priests, Father Cardinal's Lenten sermon, Frère du Monde, and lest we forget, Esprit, which long ago had its avant-garde moment. Consider all the extraordinary developments in the religious ideology of certain groups among the lower clergy, and even a few members of the high clergy in some Latin American countries, to say nothing of Father Torres, who died fighting with the guerrillas. Thus we shall say that scholastic practice produces particular forms that may be termed scholastic ideology, the ideology of elementary school teachers, realized in the publications and initiatives of the SN1, or of teachers in secondary schools and higher education and so on, and many other forms that we cannot, for material reasons, discuss here. We shall do so elsewhere. For example, political parties too produce forms of internal ideology. There is no need to draw the reader a picture. Since we have already mentioned Stalin, let us simply note that the ideology of a certain practice of the USSR's political leadership became manifest at a certain point in the country's history in what is called the personality cult, a purely discretely descriptive term, as if a personality could by itself produce the ideology of its cult, and so on. We could go on indefinitely, discussing entertainment, sport, news, publishing, and so on. That would be fascinating. The examples already adduced, however, are enough to make our thesis clear. We must now state it, not negatively, but positively. We shall therefore say that a distinction must be made here. We must distinguish between, on the one hand, the determinate elements of the state ideology that are realized in and exist in a determinate apparatus and its practices, and on the other, the ideology that is produced in this apparatus by its practices. To mark this distinction terminologically, we shall call the former ideology the primary ideology, and the latter a byproduct of the practice in which the primary ideology is realized, the secondary, subordinate ideology. Let us note another important point. We shall say that this secondary ideology is produced by the practice of the apparatus that realizes the primary ideology. But that is just a convenient way of putting it. For no practice in the world produces its ideology all by itself. There is no spontaneous ideology, although it can be useful, in other words, terminologically convenient when making a specific point, to use the expression spontaneous ideology. In the case to hand, these secondary ideologies are produced by a conjunction of complex causes. Among them are, alongside the practice in question, the effect of other external ideologies, other external practices, and, in the final instance, the effects, however veiled, of the class struggle, even its remote effects, which are in fact very close. No one will presume to deny it if he pays a little attention to what has been going on for a while now in the ideology of certain religious circles, in and around schools, from May on, and in families since May. Thus, if we want to understand what institutions, the church, the schools, and so on, are, and on top of that, what the secondary ideological subformations secreted by the practices of these institutions are, we have to set out from the ideological formations deriving from the state ideology and realized in those institutions and their practices. For it is these ideological formations which provide us with the key to both the institutions in question and their practices, and also some of the causes that produce the ideological subformations that we see emerging in those practices. Doubtless, none of this is very easy to envisage in the immediate notions offered us by the self-evident truths in which we live, since we live in ideology, even if we also have a few scientific concepts in our heads. But we have to think it. The initial form of the thought that occurs to us will of course be couched in terms of the famous common-sense schemes that Hegel already dismissed as drivel, the interaction schemes. Someone will say, straining to make a big concession in the first part of his statement, true, the primary ideological formations, religious ideological formations and so on, are realized in institutions. But he will add, since there is action and reaction everywhere in the world, institutions produce the secondary ideology that we observe in them by reacting back on the primary formations. It is with fustian of this sort that we make our peace with the dialectic. The reader will not be surprised to learn that inasmuch as action and reaction are the night in which all cows are grey, because they effectively mean that everything is in everything and the other way around, we shall be sending our grey cows back into their night. We think, on the contrary, that it is necessary to keep a firm grip on the first part of the statement. Primary ideological formations are realized in institutions, while temporarily leaving aside an element, that is, while abstracting from an element, as Marx does in order to carry out his scientific analyses in Capital, that can only confuse everything, since it is secondary, subordinate, and derivative, namely, the internal ideological formations that we have identified as byproducts. We shall say that a church is, qua institution, a realization of religious ideology. We shall say that a school or educational system is a realization of ideology. What kind of ideology? Let us leave the question in abeyance. We shall say that a political party is a realization of a political ideology, and so on. The same goes for all the institutions we have listed. But beware, a church, a school, a party do not each constitute one ideological state apparatus. Rather, each forms a component part of different systems, which we term ideological state apparatuses, the religious system, scholastic system, political system, and so on. We shall add, at the risk of repeating ourselves, the ideological formations that we can correlate with the practices at work in these institutions are not the product of the primary ideologies realized in these institutions, but byproducts of that ideology, insofar as they are the products of practices at work in those institutions. It is perfectly plain that there also exist direct relations between the primary ideological formations, which are external to the institutions, and the secondary ideological subformations internal to them. However, these relations cannot be conceived in terms of action and reaction, for the good reason that these relations do not always exist, and when they do, are realized in accordance with laws altogether different from the so-called dialectical laws of interaction. To put it very precisely, they are realized as a result of the intervention of another reality that we have not yet been able to discuss, because it is unfortunately impossible to say everything at once. We can, anticipating, call this reality by its name, the class struggle and its ideological effects. Provisionally, then, we shall content ourselves with our thesis, because we want to proceed in proper order. The ideological state apparatuses are the realization, the existence of the ideological formations dominating them. 6. The double functioning of the state apparatuses and their concerted action. Since I just introduced the clarification functioning primarily on, a word of explanation is in order. It will account for the use of the common term apparatus in two different expressions: repressive state apparatus, ideological state apparatus. I think I can claim that all state apparatuses, repressive and ideological alike, function simultaneously on repression and on ideology, but with one very important distinction that precludes confusing the repressive apparatus with the ideological state apparatuses. The repressive state apparatus, for its part, functions in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on repression, at the limit, direct physical repression, while functioning secondarily on ideology. The army and police, for instance. Internally, they train their own recruits both by repression and ideological inculcation. Externally, they act by violent repression, but also by discussion and persuasion. The latter watchwords appear black on white in the circulars issued by police chiefs and army generals possessed of a modicum of good sense. In May 1968, Mr. Grimaud, the Paris police chief, conducted discussions in person with the wild ones during the battles in the Place Maubert. The army and police also operate with the help of their own ideological aura. Join the army and learn a trade, and the prestige of their uniforms. Join the riot police and you'll stand guard over the beaches, and so on. Similarly, we may say, but the other way around, that the ideological state apparatuses, for their part, function in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on ideology, while functioning secondarily on repression, even if it is, at the limit, but only at the limit quite attenuated and more or less symbolic. Let us give a few examples of this secondary repressive functioning of apparatuses that function in overwhelmingly preponderant fashion on ideology. The school and the church, to take only those two examples, train not just their officiants, teachers and priests, but also their wards, school children, the faithful, and so on, with the appropriate methods of punishment, once exclusively and often still physical, and also, of course, moral. Expulsion, selection, and so on. News and information, publishing, and entertainment carry out with, or much more subtly, without the backing of the law, daily censorship, which is unremitting and extremely vigilant, since this censorship lodges itself in advance in the heads of authors who take the precaution of censoring themselves in the name, of course, of their professional conscience and decency, or the proper behavior that one owes the fatherland, the dead, and families, leaving aside virtue, which has lost a bit of its luster these days, since intellectual freedom has to be lodged somewhere, for instance, in two-bit eroticism. I do not think I need to multiply illustrations for the reader to understand from the ones just adduced that very subtle combinations of repression and ideologization, explicit or tacit, are forged in and among all the state apparatuses, whether they are primarily repressive or primarily ideological, and that these very subtle combinations would allow us, if we succeeded in analyzing their mechanisms, to account for the manifest pacts and unambiguous or even ambiguous objective forms of complicity that are forged among the various state apparatuses, not only on major occasions, when the bourgeois state is threatened by open working-class struggle, but every single day of our humdrum lives. A little police or a lot, a little army on the move here, a little UNR or CDR there, a little Paul VI or Archbishop Marty in their sector, a little François in its, a little or a lot of de Gaulle, Couve, for Cardinal Danielou on the radio, a little Grand Rabbi on Israel, a little Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber on the American Challenge, a little Louis Armand on Teilhard de Chardin, a little scene for the Club Med on the back of the bus, Publicis posters of naked young mothers or tomato juice on all the walls, inspired articles or works by our great ideologues, living or dead, in Le Figaro and the bookshops, the obligatory sermons on literature, humanism, and our Lord in the universities and the churches alike. In the domain of ideologization, all this constitutes the multiform arsenal of a power whose center is and remains the state, that is to say, the bourgeois holders of state power, who exercise their class power through the various specialized apparatuses with which the state is endowed. 7. Fragility and solidity of the ideological state apparatuses. Let us take the example of contemporary France. The state, under the class leadership of the representatives of French imperialism, France is great, France is beautiful, France is generous, who hold state power in France and are in command of its apparatuses, executes their class politics by means of those apparatuses, repressive and ideological. The apparatuses conscientiously do their daily duty. They constantly lend one another a hand in an overtly and tacitly concerted operation, and in the forms required by the ticklishness or brutality of the situation. That this does not take place without contradictions, and that in particular, the ideological subformations produced in the apparatuses by their own practice should sometimes make the gears grate and grind is inevitable. It would even appear that the police hesitated at a certain point in May, and that people in high places did not have much confidence in how the troops would have acted had it become necessary to call on their services. Everyone knows that because protest is infectious, some priests and even some teachers are balking now that their pupils, those little devils who, my God, but why, no longer have any respect for authority and are no longer inclined to take the moon for green cheese, to the utter dismay of the most respectable associations of parents of school children, a component part of a redoubtable ideological state apparatus. But, somehow or other, when an ideological state apparatus, such as the school or family, is ailing, the others, thank the Lord, manage to hold out for a while, and, with de Gaulle's help, and if the dominant ideology is still functioning properly among broad sectors of the population, the bourgeois state manages to hold up, and its various apparatuses do too. For how long? That is another story. Until state power and the state apparatus themselves are taken by storm in what is known as a revolution. But precisely, since we have just invoked revolution, we can spell out what we meant by grating in the ISAs. We may say that the stuff of which the ISAs are made is such, and that they function in such a way that we must consider them to be relatively fragile apparatuses, given the shocks of the class struggle which affect them through the ideological sub-formations anchored in certain aspects of their practices. In this they differ from the repressive apparatus, made of completely different stuff that is much harder to put a dent in. Rather, we should say that the ISAs are apparently fragile apparatuses, for we have to say at the same time that they are extraordinarily strong and tough. It is enough to read the texts that Lenin wrote in the last years of his life in order to see how profoundly he was haunted by this problem after the victory of the revolution. The repressive apparatus of the feudal capitalist state, army police, had basically been destroyed. This did not hold for the administration. Yet that was not Lenin's essential concern. His essential anguished concern was, above all, would the parents of school children be founded to denounce the gangrene that threatens, on the parents' side of the line, the traditional paternalistic virtues of, among others, familial understanding, generosity, and tolerance. I'm not joking. What is going on in families these days should be far greater cause for concern for our worthy vice principals, TN, responsible for school discipline, than what is going on in the schools. The reader would do well to recall this when we speak, as we shall in a moment, of a certain school-family dyad. It is also no wonder that, in comparison with the big brouhaha about disorder in the schools, the discussion of what is going on in families is much more discreet. Homme ne oblige. Family business is settled in the privacy of the family. It is in fact as if some parents of school children were demanding that the state settle the problems that they are having in their own families with their own children by restoring order in the schools. These are things that really should be kept hush-hush, for if they were not, would we not have to admit that in a certain regard, the family does indeed have something to do with an ideological state apparatus, and that the class struggle even produces some of its effects in families? We think so. Interestingly, the facts themselves are coming forward to lend support to our thesis. Proletarian state's ideological state, apparatuses, its political apparatus, the party, the Soviets, the number one problem being their connections to the masses, their capacity to control the state administrative apparatus and root out its bureaucratic tendency. Its trade union apparatus, here too the number one problem was, what should a trade union be? A non-coercive apparatus, a school of communism that could reliably ensure, via a series of transmission belts, the right connection to the masses. Finally, its scholastic apparatus, which was, for Lenin, the problem of problems, for he knew that the scholastic ISA is determinant, since it has the future in its power, the younger generations. What conclusions should we draw from this tragic concern of Lenin's after the seizure of state power and the destruction of the better part of the bourgeois repressive state apparatus? The conclusion that follows: it is not enough to destroy the repressive apparatus, it is also necessary to destroy and replace the ideological state apparatuses. New ones have to be put in place, urgently. Otherwise, Lenin was right, the very future of the revolution will be jeopardized. For it is extremely hard to replace the old ISAs, in this case the Russian bourgeois ISAs, and it takes a long time. A long time is needed, for example, truly to establish a whole new proletarian political, trade union, and school system. One must first know exactly what to put in place, what new systems to invent, and how to put them in place. The right line must be found for each of these systems, down to the details. Finally, competent personnel loyal to the revolution have to be trained to apply the new revolutionary politics in each new ISA. In short, to imbue the practice and consciousness of all Soviet citizens with the new state ideology, proletarian ideology, if one does not succeed in this, and a fortiori, if one does not make a serious, thoroughgoing attempt with no concessions to come to grips with this crucial problem, what happens? The old, bourgeois, ISAs remain in place, wholly or partially, or they are hardly undermined. If the old personnel remains in place, whatever one does and whatever one claims, the old model ISAs, either intact or half-reformed, pursue their old work in new institutional forms. The proletarian ideology of the proletarian state is not realized. That is, the masses are not imbued with proletarian ideology, and the gigantic school of communism that the new ISAs should represent does not go into operation. Instead, what remains of the old ISAs, in fact, continues to imbue the masses with the old bourgeois or petit bourgeois ideology, even alongside new elements that clash with that ideology, elements that it is their mission to inculcate. In this matter, Lenin, who abhorred decrees, was perfectly well aware that things could not be settled by decree or from on high. He also knew that there existed no prefabricated, ready-made a priori plan or line for establishing these new ISAs. He knew that it was a task that had to be worked on every minute. Better, that it was a long experimentation involving huge risks, to which all available resources of intelligence, imagination, and political dedication had to be committed, a long struggle that would brook no weakness or failure, a struggle that could not be waged simply by dint of coercive administrative measures, but that called for detailed knowledge, for education and persuasion, as well as explanation, constant explanation. A struggle that could not be carried out by a handful of militants, however lucid and courageous, but that depended on appeals to the masses, to their judgment and their reactions, their initiatives and inventions. If this struggle is not won, it can certainly not be won in the space of a few months or even a few years, and a fortiori, if it is not truly, seriously begun, on the right political mass basis, the future of the construction of socialism may encounter forbidding obstacles and may even be compromised. If instead of functioning ever more clearly on proletarian state ideology, the new proletarian ideological state apparatuses continue to function, by some mischance, on the old bourgeois and petit bourgeois ideology, or a questionable mix of the old and new ideologies. If the old ideology is not rooted out, who can prove to us that the old ideology will not, even under the official facade of socialist state institutions, formally and officially socialist, survive, reproduce itself, and spawn a terribly dangerous effect, insinuating itself for good and all into one or another weak spot in the relations of production or the political relations of the socialist state? What becomes of the Soviets in that event? What becomes of the trade unions? What becomes of the proletarian school system? When Lenin made such frequent reference, couched in the terms of a dramatic, solemn warning to the danger of capitalist survivals in a socialist regime, to the terrible onus of tradition, and in particular of petit bourgeois ideology, he plainly had in mind the reproduction of capitalist relations of production owing to the survival and re-emergence of petty production. But he was surely also thinking of these questions, which haunted him, and which he hoped would find a temporary solution in the proper functioning of the workers' and peasants' inspectorate, the questions of ideology whose fate in the new proletarian state's new ideological state apparatuses was still far from settled. Lenin died before he could see to settling these decisive questions. He handed them down to his successor, Stalin. Did Stalin settle them? Where are the Soviets, the trade unions, and the proletarian school system today, after Stalin in the USSR? If Stalin neglected these questions, as a number of effects give us reason to believe he did, precisely the effects of the personality cult, have they been seriously and thoroughly re-examined since? To spell out our preoccupation, is it not to a great extent the fact that these questions were not settled or were only half settled, which explains the principles now commanding Soviet politics, its difficulties, the problems it is having with the reform of planning, and even some of its otherwise incomprehensible impasses and initiatives, such as the military intervention in Czechoslovakia? 8 Summary. To close this long analysis, let us try to summarize our results. We can now put the essential elements of the state in place. The number one question when it comes to the state is the question of the possession of state power. The whole political class struggle revolves around this question. In a class social formation, possession of state power is always possession of state power by a social class or an alliance of social classes. The exploiting class or classes the proletarian class in the transitional phase of the dictatorship of the proletariat that should lead to socialism, a social formation dominated by a mode of production without classes. With possession of state power comes power over the state apparatuses, which constitute the very nature of the state. The state apparatus comprises 2 types of apparatuses. 1. The repressive state apparatus, the government, administration, army, police, and specialized repressive corps, gendarmerie, courts, judiciary, prisons, and so on. This apparatus is a single, centralized corps. 2. The ideological state apparatuses, in our social formations: scholastic, religious, familial, political, associative, cultural, the news and information apparatus, and so on. These apparatuses are multiple, relatively independent, and unified as a distinct system by all or part of the state ideology. The repressive state apparatus functions primarily on repression, physical or not. The ideological state apparatuses function primarily on ideology. The overall unity of the system formed by all the state apparatuses is ensured by the unity of the class politics of the class holding state power, and by the state ideology corresponding to the fundamental interests of the class or classes in power. The object of the politics of the class in power and of the state ideology, dominant ideology equals ideology of the dominant class, is to guarantee the conditions for the exploitation of the exploited classes by the dominant classes. Above all, the reproduction of the relations of production in which this exploitation takes place. Since these relations of production are the relations of exploitation of the class social formation under consideration, thus everything is clearly based on the infrastructure of the relations of production, that is, the relations of class exploitation. The base or infrastructure of the class state is thus well and truly, as Lenin said, exploitation. The effect produced by the superstructure is simultaneously to ensure the conditions under which this exploitation is carried out, repressive state apparatus, and the reproduction of the relations of production, that is, of exploitation, ideological state apparatuses. There can be no question of examining the functioning of the individual ideological state apparatuses in an essay whose sole aim is to establish that they exist and to indicate their function. Indeed, each ideological state apparatus, if its mechanisms are to be fully clarified, merits detailed, thoroughgoing analysis. We shall soon provide a first example with an analysis of the capitalist scholastic apparatus. What matters to us here is, first of all, to understand how ideology brings off the feat of making things and people go all by themselves. However, before we can get to that point, that is, before we can sketch a theory of the functioning of ideology in general, it is imperative, to avoid all misunderstanding, that we make a few remarks about what we call using a term that may surprise readers, especially Marxist readers, the political and associative ideological state apparatuses. Brief remarks on the political and associative ideological state apparatuses of the French capitalist social formation. It is indeed imperative that we insert a few remarks here to enable readers to understand our concepts and perceive their theoretical and political utility, which is possible only if all misunderstanding is avoided. Two misunderstandings complicate from the outset the extension of the concept ISA to the world of politics and the world of the unions. Indeed, as the present remarks will show us, they complicate any utilization of the concept of the ISA. Our aim here is to eliminate these two misunderstandings from the very beginning of our discussion. I shall go straight to the heart of what will inevitably pose an apparent problem for all readers. Classifying organizations of the proletarian political class struggle, the party, or economic class struggle, the trade union, under the rubric of IS as of the bourgeois state. To make this only apparent problem disappear, we have to spell out 2 points. 1. A proletarian political party and a proletarian trade union have indeed figured among the ISAs of the French social formation since the 1920s, although they were outlawed for a certain period under Pétain, and have managed to survive only at the price of constant repressive measures, the condemnation and imprisonment of communist leaders at various times between 1921 and 1939, the Reef War, and again in 1929, for example. They are officially registered as organizations, have been recognized and enjoy the corresponding legal rights. They are component parts of the corresponding French ISAs. Their ideology, however, insofar as it is the proletarian ideology of class struggle, cannot be considered to be a realization of the bourgeois state ideology that is realized in the IS as of which the party and trade union are component parts. It is, in its very principle, radically opposed to the bourgeois state ideology. Hence the paradox. How can a component part of the system of an ISA figure in the system of a bourgeois ISA, while being the realization of an ideology of proletarian class struggle? The answer is simple. It has to do, not with the logic of the system of the corresponding ISAs, but rather with the logic of a long class struggle that imposed legal recognition of the party and the proletarian class struggle trade union, as well as their inscription in the ISAs in question. It was as organizations of proletarian class struggle that these organizations, by dint of their struggle in the history of the French social formation, imposed this recognition and this inscription, hence by force. It is by dint of class struggle that they are able to preserve their proletarian class ideology in the ISAs in question. Thus the proletarian party and trade union have a place in these ISAs. Legally, they are part of them, and legally, they should enjoy all the rights that accrue to them as a result of their recognition and inscription in them. In actual fact, they are constantly treated as the object of special measures in them. In the Parliament, communist votes are not taken into account. The Communist Party is declared to be the party of a foreign country or a separatist party and is walled off in a political class ghetto in the apparatus itself. The same tactic is applied to the proletarian trade union, except when there is no other choice. It is refused advantages granted to the others, and negotiations are conducted with the others. There is an antagonistic contradiction here that the bourgeoisie is in principle incapable of assimilating. If it has consented to the compromise, it is because it could not do otherwise. There we have an effect of the development of the class struggle. Formally speaking, there is no contradiction in saying that one of the component parts of a system, while figuring in the system, does not radically compromise the nature of the system. Proletarian ideology has not conquered the system of the political or the associative ISA. On the contrary, bourgeois state ideology continues to dominate them. It is clear that this creates, under certain circumstances, problems for the functioning of the bourgeois political and associative ISAs. The bourgeoisie disposes, however, of a whole series of tried and tested techniques for meeting this danger. We shall see which ones. 2. The products of a class struggle external to the IS. As under consideration, the proletarian party and trade union wage their class struggle within the limits of the ISAs, and obviously their legal forms. Great dangers obviously threaten this delicate practice of the class struggle by proletarian organizations in bourgeois ISAs. They can be collectively summed up as the danger of lapsing into class collaboration, parliamentary cretinism for the party, and economism for the trade union, both of which are forms of reformism. We shall come back to this. However that may be, the class struggle that has imposed the presence of the proletarian party and trade union in the corresponding ISAs infinitely exceeds the very limited struggle that they can conduct in these ISAs. Created by a class struggle external to the ISAs, sustained by it, charged with furthering and sustaining it by all available legal means, the proletarian organizations that figure in the ISAs concerned would betray their mission if they reduced the external class struggle, which merely finds a reflection in very limited forms in the class struggle carried out in the ISAs, to this class struggle internal to the ISAs. The social democratic workers' parties are perfect examples of component parts of the bourgeois ISAs, which allow themselves to be assimilated by both bourgeois state ideology and the rules of the political and associative game of these ISAs. These parties' ideology is merely a subproduct for workers' consumption of bourgeois ideology, petty bourgeois reformist ideology. Their politics is at the price of the right to get worked up now and again or work their jaws. A politics of class collaboration. We can then understand Lenin's categorical warnings against the social democratic parties or trade unions' reformist ideology and politics of class collaboration. Component parts of the ISAs in question, they let themselves be wholly integrated into them and assimilated by them. When their leaders are in power, that is, at the head of the government, bringing down a government must not be confused with taking state power. They conduct themselves, in Leon Blum's lovely phrase, as loyal managers of the capitalist regime, which they have no desire really to overthrow, at least not in deeds whatever their declarations. I am well aware that in certain conjunctures they can let themselves be dragged into doing more than they would really like, but when that happens, they really cannot be blamed for it. It is no accident that the social democratic organizations are included with full rights in the bourgeois ISAs. From the bourgeoisie standpoint, they take their places as full-fledged members of them, and are not confined to any political or trade union ghetto. More, they are the essential component part of the corresponding ISAs, and the bourgeoisie makes very able use of them to counter the very troublesome component part represented by a proletarian party or trade union. The whole history of bourgeois politics for the last 80 years is based on this tactic of dividing the working class forces at the level of politics and trade union organization alike. Thanks to this technique, the bourgeoisie effectively annuls the presence of proletarian organizations in its ISAs. 2. A few historical facts. To bring out the full significance of the 2 points I have just very schematically developed, I propose to recall a few empirical facts that will help us grasp how and why proletarian class struggle organizations figure in bourgeois ISAs. To begin with, it is enough to consider what happens in social formations other than the French or Italian formation in order to understand that this result is unintelligible if the history of the class struggle specific to these countries is not taken into account. Let us first adduce 2 examples that simple comparison makes instructive. The bourgeois fascist regimes, whether in Europe or Latin America, to take only those 2 cases, created working-class organizations that were wholly in their service, fully integrated component parts of the ISAs of the fascist state. In fascist Germany and fascist Italy, as well as in Perón's Argentina, there existed labor fronts or state trade unions. Perón even came up with the following admirable phrase: The bourgeoisie should organize the working class. That is the best way to protect it against Marxism. The Franco regime's state trade unions exemplify this even today. The fact that, in these unions, things are not going for the best for Franco's politics is assuredly not the fault of the state ideology or the minister in charge of the state workers or students' unions. Another example. In a number of capitalist countries, proletarian class struggle organizations are quite simply banned. The balance of power in the class struggle, especially in certain Asian, African, and Latin American countries directly or indirectly controlled by US imperialism, has not been able to impose recognition of these organizations. One final example. In a number of capitalist countries, workers' organizations are very well integrated into the system of the capitalist IS, for instance, in the Scandinavian countries, ruled by socialists, or in England. The course of the class struggle in England has culminated in the victory of a reformist line. Trade unionist in the unions, Labourite in the Labour Party. There is, of course, unrest among the rank and file, but for the moment, the trade union and Labour Party leadership still basically work hand in hand. The result is that the trade unions and the Labour Party are indeed perfectly integrated component parts of the system of the political and associative IS as of the capitalist imperialist English state. Is there any need to make the demonstration for the American trade unions or the German trade unions and German Social Democratic Party? It is sometimes even the case that reformist political and trade union organizations are capitalist economic powers, as in England, the USA, and Germany. How does it happen, then, that the situation is different in France? How does it happen that the French bourgeoisie has had to resign itself to recognizing, without being able to neutralize, organizations that the bourgeoisie in other countries and other circumstances has either succeeded in organizing by taking over their leadership itself, or in banning, or in purely and simply subordinating to itself and assimilating? The answer lies in the history of the French class struggle. The history of the French bourgeoisie is dominated by a great event that it botched: the French Revolution. From the bourgeois point of view, this was truly a dirty revolution. In a clean revolution, as in England for example, things would have been the object of a gentleman's agreement between the leading classes, feudal aristocratic and bourgeois industrial mercantile. Unfortunately, thanks to the stupidity of a bankrupt rural petty aristocracy which, in the 1780s, had the bad taste to demand its feudal rights at all costs in a day and age in which, consider Turgot, they were being quietly abolished, and for other reasons as well, of course. Things took a nasty turn. The people made their entrance onto the scene and did not pull their punches. There were peasant uprisings in the countryside, where castles started going up in flames, and journeys révolutionnaires in the cities, especially Paris, where very quickly, despite the night of August 4th and the Girondists' reformist politics, the most uncontrollable of the plebeians poured onto the streets of Paris, imposed their revolutionary committees, and brought Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety to power, among other things. The counter-revolutionary war, the fraternal feudal states rushed to the rescue of the king and queen, who had, together with the émigrés, requested that they intervene, made the class war even harsher and more radical. For a time, the popular masses' patriotism and the revolution, reinforced by the measures of public safety that the bourgeoisie has labeled the terror, confronted that bourgeoisie with the threat of something altogether different from its revolution: sinister prospects in which a certain fourth estate of sans-culottes, poverty-stricken plebs, demanded a social, egalitarian republic from which mercantile and industrial capitalism had everything to fear. On the horizon were the pamphlets and speeches of Marat and other agitators and propagandists for equality. There was something in the air that found expression in the communism of a Babeuf and a Buonarroti, in forms that were still primitive yet unmistakable. The French bourgeoisie has not forgotten the terror. The Commune filled it with the same terror, and it reacted with the same white terror in both cases. It had to take emergency measures to put the popular masses back in their place, not in power, but at work, under its exploitation and domination. The stages in this process were Thermidor, then the Consulate, then Bonaparte and Napoleon. Bonapartism is a typically French solution to the problem represented by the style of the class struggles unleashed in France by this unfortunate revolution of 1789. It is the standard bourgeois solution for putting the popular masses back in their place when conflicts between the dominant classes have not been able to prevent their direct, armed intervention on the stage of the overt class struggle, or worse, have made it necessary. It is no accident that the bourgeoisie has entrusted power to a providential Bonapartist figure whenever the division between the dominant classes and the intervention of the popular masses has put the bourgeois class's domination in jeopardy after the 1789 revolution, to put the people in their place and establish the apparatuses of the bourgeois state, its superstructure, law, the civil code, and ideological state apparatuses, its universities no less than its chambers of commerce and so on, as well as the Comédie Française, to say nothing of the Concordat. After the terribly frightening alert constituted by the proletariat's June 1848 intervention on the barricades, in the wake of the twofold crisis that divided the French bourgeoisie, the 1940 defeat, and then the Algerian insurrection, Napoleon I, Napoleon III, and de Gaulle are the price that the French bourgeoisie had, or still has to pay, for the history of its own class struggles, during which it has had to resign itself to the outpouring of plebs and then the proletariat into the streets in order to achieve its own objectives. It was not enough that the bourgeoisie diverted the results of popular struggles in 1789, 1830, and 1848 to its own exclusive advantage. It also made the popular masses pay a very high price in blood, the White Terror, the 1848 massacres, and in the mass arrests, condemnations and deportations of December 2nd for contributing to its own class struggles. Bonapartism and ferocious repression have been its solutions. It is the French bourgeoisie's misfortune that the plebeians, and very soon the proletariat, were steeled in the struggles of the journey's revolutionaires, learning the art of building barricades and fighting the army on them, and that the bourgeoisie was in some sense forced by its own history to educate the popular masses and the proletariat, which saw that it could one day take up arms and fight on its own behalf. As a famous phrase has it, the emancipation of the working class must be the work of the working class itself. These words were inscribed in history by Marx and Engels. The manifesto was published in 1848. In 1864, the International was founded. The lesson was not lost on the French proletariat. There followed what is known as the Paris Commune. One of the disadvantages, for the bourgeoisie itself, of the Bonapartist solution is its instability. It always comes to a bad end. The reasons vary. The arbitrariness of personal power, which ultimately becomes an encumbrance. The providential man really takes himself for France, and, in the long run, can maintain his position only by staging military expeditions. Napoleon I, Napoleon III, which, since they meet with the resistance of the peoples occupied as a result, ultimately take a bad turn, culminating in adventurist military operations, Spain, Mexico, and so on. Things took a very bad turn at Sedan against Prussia. There occurred after Sedan an unprecedented event, one that left its stamp on human history, the history of socialism, but also the history of the class struggle as a whole, the Commune. While Mr. Thiers' big bourgeoisie was colluding with the Prussian occupiers in Versailles, the Parisian proletariat assumed the leadership of the patriotic resistance, wresting for the first time in history the cause of the defense of the nation away from the bourgeoisie. For class reasons, This sudden turnabout led to the first attempt to make a socialist revolution in human history. That reckless, unheard of, desperate but formidable experiment in which the working class and popular masses invented what theory had only had a presentiment of, the destruction of the state and its apparatuses. That experiment that left its mark on Marx and Lenin, and is still being invoked at the other end of the world, in China. Everyone knows how the French bourgeoisie, relying on the Prussian occupier, put the people back in their place, up against the walls, where tens of thousands of men and women were killed in broad daylight, before the people were sent back their posts in production, in exploitation. I shall cut this short in order to say that the lesson of all these class struggles, which were exemplary, Engels, not for the bourgeoisie, but for the proletariat and the French people, was such that the bourgeoisie had to recognize the political and trade union organizations of the proletarian class struggle once they had succeeded, despite tremendous difficulties and unheard-of sacrifices in imposing themselves. The bourgeoisie, taken at its word, not only the one it had uttered in the course of the struggles of its 18th century ideologues and writers, but also that of its democratic tradition, liberty, equality, fraternity, tripped up the fact that the working masses had offered its support, that it had not disdained in 1830, nor in February 1848, nor in the ultimate paroxysms of its class struggle against the aristocracy, for instance, its late 19th century struggle against the church. In short, taken by the throat by the power of the popular and then proletarian class struggle, the bourgeoisie opted to recognize the political and trade union organizations of proletarian class struggle in its ISAs. It did so in the hope of defeating them there, getting the better of them, perverting them, if need be, or neutralizing them by pitting the social democratic organizations against them. That is certain. But reason or ruse, impotence or finesse, the facts are the facts. That the same does not hold for other countries is, in the final analysis, a question of the balance of power in a historical class struggle. What I have just said about this question in France shows, at any rate, the true nature of the class struggle. It can unfold in the forms prescribed by the law prevailing in the ISAs under consideration only as a simple effect, a simple relay of an altogether different class struggle, which infinitely exceeds all the legal forms in which it may also manage to find expression. The political and associative ideological state apparatuses,